Hey guys, how's it going? You guys survived the weekend? Did you guys do anything fun, trick-or-treating wise or anything? No, nothing? You got nothing. All right, we are making our way through the National Academy of Sciences report. So the Impacts on Human Health group had finished up their presentation, and we didn't really have time to get to questions. So let's open it up to everyone. What questions do you guys have for the human health group? Anybody? You guys got nothing, really? Trying to find what I did with my comment sheets I was grading on last week. Oh. All right, well, I'll start with me since you guys are not saying anything. One of the questions I had, so at the very beginning of the presentation, and I forget who was doing that part of the presentation, there was a mention that doing these kinds of studies on human populations is difficult because you can't just, subject a bunch of people to eating GE foods and allow a control group to not eat GE foods, and so you have to have other methods of doing this. And so later on in the chapter, around page 207 or so, they talked about different ways of looking at health effects of genetically engineered foods, looking at basically epidemiological data. And the group didn't really mention these studies at all in their presentation, and so I felt that they should address what are two mechanisms for looking at the human health effects of genetically engineered foods that don't involve things like animal testing and things like that. Can you guys who were in this group address those methods and what they found from those methods? Because I found these particular studies particularly informative. This would be data in figures 5-4, 5-5, 5-6, 5-7. Five -9, 5-10. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, hang on. I'm just going to go look.
That was right after my section, so I'm reading through it now.
So who was in charge of this section of the chapter?
It was Alyssa, I think.
Where is Alyssa? There's Alyssa. Alyssa, was this your section of the chapter? I mean, any of you should be able to answer this, but if it was one particular person's main focus.
So they look at the actual, they didn't look at animal tests. They look at the studies that did the testing.
No, that's not what's going on in this section of the chapter. So yeah, in all these cases, in all of the cases for this entire report, these scientists are not doing their own studies. They're reviewing studies that have already been done. And so in the early part of this chapter, they looked at the results of animal studies that had been conducted and reviewed those. So this whole book is basically a big review of previous research. But in the second half of this chapter, they started to look directly at data from human epidemiological tracking. So most major industrialized countries have organizations like the Centers for Disease Control that basically track human health data. And so there are a set of federal bureaucrats who are career bureaucrats at federal agencies who are largely tasked with the job of gathering data and making those data available to policymakers. They exist in the CDC, they exist in the National Institutes of Health, they exist in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, people who are basically they're tasked with the process of gathering data, making sure that those data are as correct as they can be, and getting those data available to the American public and to policymakers. And so what these people did who wrote this report is they went and mined that data and used those data in like figure 5.4, 5.5, 5.6, 5.7, 5.10. And those figures are useful and informative, but what's the methodology that they're utilizing to look at incidence of disease as it might be affected by genetically engineered organisms? You can't do an experiment on humans in this way and on large populations of humans to answer these questions. So they're using an alternative method. What is that method? And then what did it show?
From what I'm getting from reading it, they're looking at like the like conditions basically of people in that area with mortality rates, cancer rates, and like things like that. And they're in that inference to say like if GE foods were affecting them, there would be a change to these numbers that we could see.
Yeah, so for example, in 5-4, it says trends of cancer incidence in women in the United States. And one of the things that you'll see is there's a vertical dotted line there that shows when GE foods came on the market in the United States. And so you would expect, just like with the yield figures that they looked at in the previous chapter, where you saw yields were increasing before GE crops came online, and then they continue to increase, but the slope of that increase didn't really change, which indicates that GE crops aren't really necessarily affecting yield. They may be affecting other aspects of a farmer's existence, but they're not really affecting yield. You can use these kind of before and after sorts of experiments where you look at what was happening in a population before, you look at what was happening in a population after. And if, for example, lung cancer in women, which is what one of the lines in figure 5.4 is about, lung cancer in women seems to be going up slightly in the years before GE crops came on the scene, and it seems to have kind of leveled off after that. Well, for one thing, there's not a lot of connection between the food that you eat and lung cancer, but that's probably reflective more of changes in women's health in other areas. A more indicative thing might be, for example, liver cancer, which is the brownish orange line at the very bottom, and you see that it's creeping up oh so slightly since 1996, but it was also creeping up oh so slightly before 1996. So the rate of growth hasn't really changed much. You look at figure 5-5, and one of the things that you see is that lung cancer in men has actually been going down, probably because there's a history of men smoking more in the past than they do now. And that downward trend in lung cancer is good. But when you look at something that might be more connected to digestion and food intake and things like this, you look at liver cancer, which once again is relatively low, but has been creeping up since 1975. It's not creeping up any faster after 1996. And so because these rates of increase aren't really changing, you can basically say, well, if the rate, pardon me, if the rate of increase isn't changing, then presumably whatever it is that's been going on in the culture since 1975 is just continuing to go on in that culture since 1975. And so it's probably not related to this change in the food supply. What is figure 5-6 and 5-7 looking at? And this brings us to the second way in which they looked at these data.
The cancer incidences in the UK.
Okay, so this is now looking at the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom has a much lower prevalence of genetically engineered foods in their diet. And so if there was, once again, an effect of genetically engineered foods on the health of humans, you might expect to see patterns that were different and going in opposite directions in the UK than they are in the United States. But once again, if you look at liver disease, which is hard to see in figure 5-6, because it's down there at the bottom and it's obscured by like thyroid cancer, for example, you see that liver cancer, which once again is kind of related to the food that you ingest because the liver is involved in detoxifying things that you take into your body. Liver cancer is increasing ever so slightly in the UK, but once again, it's not changing the rate of increase before and after the introduction of genetically engineered foods. And you wouldn't expect it to change before and after because they eat many fewer genetically engineered foods than we do. And the figure for that first figure, figure 5-6, is for women. The figure for men, it's a little easier to see. This is figure 5-7. It's a little easier to see that line, but you see that the slope of that line is virtually identical to kind of the slope of the line in figure 5.5, which is the incidence of cancer in men in the United States. So once again, things aren't happening substantially differently in men and women in the UK versus men and women in the United States. So in order to get around the fact that you can't do these kinds of controlled experiments on humans, they used two methods to kind of address this. They use these kind of before and after studies where you look at what was happening in a population before and you look at what is happening in a population after. And then they also looked at a natural experiment, which is basically the US versus essentially Europe, where Europe as a whole has taken a much more precautionary role in terms of allowing genetically engineered organisms into their food supply, and they concentrated on the UK because the UK has a very well-established governmental health system, and the data are of high quality and relatively available. So this is a natural experiment. Nobody told the UK, hey, don't use GE foods for a while, we'll try them in the United States, and then later on we'll compare the two. But because the UK decided against using a lot of, at a governmental level, against using a lot of genetically engineered foods in their food supply, this natural experiment was set up and allows us to now compare US data to UK data, or French data, or anybody else's data in the EU. So this then allows us to kind of get a handle on whether or not this is having a broad scale effect on human health, by looking at these kinds of diseases, in this case, cancers. But you can also look at figure 510. What is figure 510 talking about?
It's US obesity rates.
Yeah, so obesity is another aspect of human health that people in the United States in particular are concerned with and talk quite a lot about. And so one of the things that might change in a genetically engineered organisms, an unintended consequence of this might be that obesity rates increase. And obesity rates have been increasing for quite some time, but it looks like kind of towards the end of this timeline, obesity rates are beginning to level out a little bit. But the main thing is that after 1996 is the rise of that obesity rate hasn't really changed slope at all. It hasn't changed slope to increase. If anything, it's changed slope over time, especially after about 2004, 2006, changed in such a way that it seems like the rate of rise of that number is actually declining. It's increasing at a lesser rate than it was before. So in the last half of this chapter, a lot of these studies are basically what was happening in the United States before versus what is happening in the United States after. And then looking at that boundary, 1996, does the pattern in the United States differ from the pattern that you see in another country where genetically engineered foods in the food mixture are much less common? So so that was one question that I had for you, and I was just surprised that I didn't see those figures in your presentation. Another thing that you didn't talk about is the precautionary principle, and this is something that they mentioned kind of towards the beginning of the chapter. So if one of you guys could explain what the precautionary principle is and how the authors of this report use it and how it might be applied to genetically engineered foods, and maybe how different governments have perhaps applied the precautionary principle relative to genetically engineered foods.
So the precautionary principle is kind of a way that scientists will like take a measure of caution in each of their studies.
Okay, and it's usually applied in response to uncertainty. So the less certain you are about an outcome, what should you do generally?
Should test more and brain isn't working. Sorry.
I'm on the 10th floor of a building. I am standing at the precipice, at the edge of the 10th floor of a building. I am playing around on the edge, practicing my balancing skills. I am 100% sure that if I fall off of this 10-story building, I'm going to die. What should I probably do?
Change things.
I should get off the ledge. Now, that's if I know for a fact there's a 100% chance that I will die. The first thing I should do is get off the ledge. But if I might die or might not die, and I'm not really sure of what the percentage chance is of dying. So let's say the percent chance of death is not 100%, but I don't know what the chance of death is. What should I do?
You should still change the experiment to where the most destructive result has a less chance of happening.
Yeah, I should probably still get off the ledge. Just because there's not a 100% chance of death, but there probably is a chance of death, and I'm not sure exactly what that chance of death is, the precautionary principle would say, get off the ledge. I actually applied the precautionary principle in my decision to hold class online this semester. What was my argument and my thought process during that decision-making process?
It was the idea that, like, during the conversation, you said, like, we would probably be fine if we went in person. However, the chance of the whole class getting COVID is not a chance that you wanted to take. And so it was better for everybody just to have it online.
So basically, and I think I talked to you guys about this at the beginning of the semester, if I recall correctly, I basically weighed a 100% chance of inconvenience. I would much rather be doing this with you guys in class. It would be much easier. You guys would talk more often. You would probably maybe, I don't know, maybe be learning better, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a 100% chance of inconvenience and probably a 100% chance of the class being less fun, a 100% chance of you learning less than you would if we were perhaps in person, et cetera, et cetera. But I had to balance that against a non-zero probability of someone getting sick, because we would be in the classroom with everyone every day. Once somebody gets sick, then all of us have to go into quarantine until we get tested. And then depending on whether or not we have the virus or not, we would either get to come back to class or we would not get to come back to class. Once you have COVID, there's then some conditional probability of you getting sick to the point that you die. And that is a conditional probability because it's conditional on whether or not you test positive, which is then leads to the possibility that you test positive and you show symptoms, and that those symptoms are then severe enough to kill you. And so I didn't phrase this in the terminology of the precautionary principle, but in my decision making, I employed the precautionary principle because in the face of uncertainty, what did I do?
Decided to take the less risk option.
Yeah, I erred on the side of caution. What the precautionary principle says is, in the face of uncertainty, behave in ways that err on the side of caution. The COVID pandemic thing has been a situation that has been rife with uncertainty. And so what everybody should be doing is erring on the side of caution. What Europe did, what the European Union did with respect to genetically engineered foods is, in the face of uncertainty, what did they do?
Erred on the side of caution.
They erred on the side of caution and said, we really don't want these things in our food supply. They may be fine, but they may not be fine. And what they said was, in the face of uncertainty, we're going to err on the side of caution and just not bring these into our food supply. That is an application of the precautionary principle. We did not express that precautionary principle in the United States, or if we did, we didn't express it to the same degree. And that's the thing about the precautionary principle. One's weighting of uncertainty versus action is going to be different from culture to culture, from governmental agency to governmental agency, from one national government to another national government. But it's this idea that in the face of uncertainty, you express a certain degree of caution. That's what enables us to then make these comparisons between the United States and the European Union, is they expressed considerably more caution where GE foods are concerned than the United States did, which then enables us to make this comparison between us and European countries. So that's an important idea to have. Blair was talking to me after class last week and mentioned that this task of summarizing this report had less critical thinking in it than he was used to in other classes. And I'm like, but there's actually quite a lot of critical thinking in this report, in that you have to critically think about the figures, for example, that are in the report, but then also this idea of the precautionary principle and how it gets applied requires a certain amount of critical thinking, because you have to then critically think through, well, is what the EU did in not allowing genetically engineered foods into their food supply, was that a good thing to do? Was that a not so good thing to do? Could that decision have been made differently? What would have been the outcomes had that decision been made differently? How would I apply the precautionary principle in things in my own life right now? There are so many things right now in the United States and in the world at large where having a knowledge of the precautionary principle and thinking carefully and critically about how you apply the precautionary principle would really, I think, provide a lot of clarity in our current decision making. Unfortunately, a lot of people aren't even aware of what the precautionary principle is, much less how they would go about applying it to everyday life. I bicycle every day. We had a negative encounter with a vehicular driver on Saturday because one of the riders that I rode with had a flat tire, and we were on the shoulder of the road changing the tire. This person drove past us and thought that we should be further off into the ditch while changing the tire, and stopped and told us that he thought that we should be further off into the ditch while changing the tire. We were like, thank you for your concern. We appreciate that, but we're on the shoulder and we feel safe here, and we've bicycled a lot and we kind of know what the risks are associated with this. But thanks, we're just going to be here another couple of minutes because we're almost done changing the tire, and we'll be on our way. Thanks for your concern. And then he got really upset just out of nowhere about us being there and got out of his car and came over and threatened us. And luckily for us, there were 7 of us and there were only 1 of him. So when I go bicycling, I also don't think about this in terms of the precautionary principle, but I'm always weighing the risk. There is always an uncertain probability that I'm going to be harassed by a driver. And I weigh that risk against the possibility of just never riding my bike again and having to get my exercise some other way. I don't really like running. I'm old now, and running is not great on the knees. Bicycling is much less taxing on the knees. And so, I have to weigh a lot of different things. So every time that I go out, my partner makes me turn on my Life 360 thing so that she can track where I'm at, so that she knows what's happening with me while I'm out on the road, because there is a non-zero probability that something bad is going to happen to me. I'll hit a stick on Shoto Traffic Way and flip over my handlebars and end up in the hospital, which happened at the beginning of the semester back in August. I don't know if you guys remember that I was struggling at the beginning of the semester because I had badly bruised ribs. But once again, you know, how big is that probability that something is really going to happen catastrophically bad to me while on my bicycle versus just never getting any exercise? My father died at the age of 64 from a heart attack. Why did he die at 64 from a heart attack? He had what a pastor friend of mine referred to as the trifecta of death. He smoked, he drank too much, and he was chronically obese. That is the trifecta of death. I think I would rather die being hit by a car than dying of a heart attack because I'm obese, I drink too much, and I smoke, which I do not smoke, by the way. So we're constantly weighing these things. Having something in our toolkit for how we weigh these things, like the precautionary principle, helps us formalize our thinking in a way that we might not formalize it if we didn't have that in our toolkit. Does that make sense? All right, the rest of you who have been silent, what questions do you have for this group? The questions that I'm asking of this group are questions that also come out of critically thinking about what they said, what they didn't say, and why they might not have said it, as well as my own critical reading of the report itself. Is this before and after thing a good thing to do? Is it a valid thing to do? Is it informative in any way? What are the pluses and minuses, the pros and cons of doing this before after sort of comparison? That all involves critical thinking. All right, let's hear from the last group, which is talking about socioeconomic impacts of genetically engineered foods. And for those of us who are listening, let us put on our critical thinking caps and think critically about what the people are telling us so that we have a suite of good questions when it's all said and done, and we don't just have to listen to Dr. Klowinski drone on about things. Mary Tinton Winston.
I can share my screen with it.
Okay, good, great. Send me the presentation at some point so I can get it posted as well. But
Okay.
yeah, just go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. So our chapter was on socioeconomic effects. And it's not going to let me change the slide.
Welcome to my world in Zoom.
Okay. So I did think it was kind of important to note before we kind of dove into all the studies that it did say like multiple different times about multiple different studies that the results may not be exclusively from the crops themselves. It could be from like uncontrollable factors like government intervention and different resources between farmers, things like that. And so first it looked at income effects, and it kind of did a general economic assessment of GE crops. And so GE crops caused a decrease in yield damage done by insects with the use of BT plants because the plant itself was insect resistant, which in turn reduces the cost of buying insecticides. So the need for insecticides is reduced. Then you reduce the labor of spraying that onto your fields. And these all factors lead to the increase of gross margins, which you can see that definition on the screen. Because GE crops reduce like variable costs because they're reducing the cost of material, things like insecticides, and also your labor time is going way down because you can reduce spraying and stuff. So then it looked at just an economic assessment of the insect resistant traits. So the numbers can be seen on the screen: a 69% increase in profit, a 25% increase in yield, and a 43% decrease in insecticide costs. It was kind of This reminded me of something George Naylor said in the Poland book, that GE crops produce more, but they also initially cost more. So you kind of have to take that into consideration when you're looking at these numbers. The next portion talked about biases, which could have skewed results of the studies. I thought the biggest one was the placement bias, which is initial technology deployment programs tend to select unique farmers. Thus, the efficiency may not be due to the crops, it could be due to other factors. And there were 5 total biases listed. The next portion of the chapter is split into looking at specifically BT cotton, BT maize, and BT eggplant individually. To summarize BT cotton analysis, it was multiple studies, all of which seemingly showed the benefits of BT cotton in both labor savings as well as increased income due to higher yields. For example, in 2007 in China, one study showed that revenue was roughly 40% higher for adopters than non-adopters. BT maize had a lot fewer studies, but they were mostly inconclusive as the outcomes varied. And BT eggplant was first planted in 2014, so there was no evidence to include when the paper was written, but it did include estimates which showed insecticide costs would decrease, fertilizer and harvesting costs would increase, and yield increase, as well as almost a 50% increase in gross margins. And I just kind of included a graph showing that the acreage of BT corn and BT cotton are going up, but insecticide usage is going down. And then it talked about herbicide resistant traits. It stated much less information was available on these. The chapter showed there wasn't much proof that income would increase. However, it did seem to be very beneficial for saving time. So HR soybean, for example, decreased labor time per household up to 14.5%. This goes into that idea that time is money, and this decrease in management of the field because the plants are herbicide resistant leads to a shift from time on the farm management to off-farm employment, and farmers can begin to make money elsewhere. And that kind of went into that idea we talked about last Monday of how farmers face this lose-lose situation because there are lower prices with higher yields and higher prices with low yields. And if they could make money doing other things, their income would be far more stable. And the next portion discussed the evidence that earliest adopters gain the most, while late adopters gain less than the first, but they still gain more than the people who don't adopt at all. And that is due to the fact that they just have to keep producing more in order to keep up with the market. And that's kind of shown in that graph right there, that those early adopters are going to gain the most. The majority is kind of going to gain that middle of the road, and the people who never adopt are just going to fall behind. And finally, it kind of talked about the incomes of small farmers. So it defines a small scale farmer as one who manages 5 hectares or less, and a hectare is 100 acres. So the article goes on to discuss the disappearing middle, which is due to the rise in the huge corporate farms that produce so much it is impossible for the middle of the road farmers to keep up, and this type of farm is disappearing. This section can be summed up to say the benefit is clear for large scale operations, but less clear for small scale farmers. And I just included that quote because I thought it was a pretty good summary. It said small scale farmers are in more financially precarious position than large scale farmers if economic benefits do not materialize. Small scale farmers are more adversely affected by their lack of return on investment in the BT trait. So it just kind of hits that point home that is a clear benefit for corporate farmers, but it's less clear for small farmers.
Yeah, so one of the most important things that this chapter was talking about specifically was the way that economic hardships can actually get exacerbated for small-scale farmers trying to make investments in GE crops, especially trying to make initial investments. So one of the vocab that gets used in this chapter is this term appropriateness, which is basically a term to denote the interplay between the amount of financial return that a farmer will have on investment alongside the economic economic cost of investment that they're undergoing in the first place. What gets found is that crops that may be appropriate or that are appropriate for large scale farmers to invest in often are not appropriate for small scale farmers to invest in because of the way that the returns come back. Specifically, if we focus in on like insect and herbicide resistances, we see that the ways that these resistances end up generating higher profits for large scale farmers, there isn't the infrastructure for small scale farmers to make those similar sorts of investments. So for example, like Mary was talking about, the way that investing in herbicide resistances will allow farmers to create profits in different areas. That sort of reworking of the like financial schema is only available for large scale farmers most of the time. So one of the things that the studies find is that a way to mitigate this gap to make small scale farmers have more opportunity is to create credit options. But the problem that is empirically shown in trying to create these credit options is that over time options become less diverse, and even initially, very often the options that are made available aren't ones that are actually going to be able to create the benefits for small scale farmers that are needed. But when small scale farmers are able to actually invest in GE crops, you see like there are certain benefits that are contextually based for whether or not a small scale farmer will benefit to investing in GE crops. Specifically, what you can look at is that there is an availability of viable credit options, like I was just going over, but also if there is availability of affordable inputs, as well as available extension services. These are ways that small scale farmers are able to make the leap to investing in GE crops or hybrid crops that will ultimately create financial benefits. And so I just went ahead and interpolated a recommendation that they give, specifically talking about how investing in research and development of genetically engineered crops over time may be one strategy to help improve the plight of small scale farmers as accessibility to GE crops and our knowledge base around them becomes more stabilized, more cost effective. And so one potential negative side that gets brought up in this chapter is that there could be a decrease in farmer skills alongside the investment in genetically engineered crops. Specifically, what this is critiquing is that transitioning to investment in genetically engineered crops may contribute to this phenomenon that's been termed de-skilling, which basically means to denote that farmers have less of the traditional farming skills that they had when they were always dealing with the crops that didn't have the GE traits. So specifically what the article brings up is that the value of mutual experimentation between farmers and the conversation that they have trying to work together year after year to deal with like the environmental factors that are preventing crop growth in the past, that the lack of mutual experimentation and conversation that will occur alongside transition to GE crops is actually detrimental to the future of farming. But the response to this, which I think is the most interesting thing that I read in this entire article, was that this concept of de-skilling probably relies upon a dubious and problematic notion of an original indigenous farmer skill set, i.e. it dehistoricizes the notion of what it means to be a good farmer. Therefore, the response to the de-skilling objection is essentially just to say, your de-skilling argument based upon a abstract and universalized notion of what a farming skill is, wherein our transition to genetically engineered crops is just creating new and unique skills that were not formerly had.
All right, so the first part of my section was what were the effects of regulation and the regulatory review process, and what kind of effects that has on the development and introduction of new crops to the market. And so the first one, it imposes a variety of costs. The first cost being to the developer of the product. So as far as the development goes, that goes into everything needed to complete the regulatory process and get that product to market. The second thing is there's a cost of benefit. So like with any new product, it provides an agronomic and economic effect and benefit. And so the cost of benefit. So any delay with bringing that product to the market, so any troubles it has going through the regulatory process or not meeting some of those requirements, that's going to impose a cost to anyone who would have otherwise benefited from this new product and crop. And then next, there's also a large cost barrier between public sector and small firms from getting to regulatory review. As I'll mention here coming up, it's very expensive to get these products to market. So public sector firms and small firms don't have the money to get these products past regulatory review. Like I previously mentioned, it's very expensive. One study showed that for a single trait crop, it can range anywhere from $50 to $100 million to get that product through regulatory compliance. And about 70% of that goes to the developmental stage to where that compliance is secured. Also, for private sector firms, it's roughly $35 million to achieve regulatory compliance. And then another study showed, and this was tested in 10 different markets, and it was testing IR and HR maize, that $7.1 million to $14.4 million for the IR maize, and then $6.2 to $14.5 million for the HR maize. So like I said, it's very expensive, and most of these public and small firms don't have the money to get it through the compliance stage. And as far as the development of these products go, in recent years, disease resistance has been demonstrated by many university scientists. So universities are considered public sector firms, but with the current regulatory compliance costs, it's kind of prohibited the scientists with these universities from turning their proof of study into a commercial product. And then the second part was the patent law, the current patent laws regarding GE products. Some of the positive things about our patent law system is the publication of the innovation, and with that publication comes with protection to the initial investor inventor. And it also creates an incentive for people to invest in the research and development, knowing that their investment is protected, and they can also potentially get a return on that initial investment. The third thing it does is it assigns risk and responsibilities, barring any consequences and things that go bad with the product. So you know who's protected and who's at fault for each thing. But there's also some concerns with the current patent law system. So for example, public sector firms like university scientists, they can report patent protection. The current patent protections now have limited their ability to research freedom and finding. So it also it inhibits kind of what they can and can't pursue research on, depending on what's patented. So that that kind of stops collaboration between companies once a patent is designed. So you can't kind of get ideas and get the total best product. And in doing that that has reduced innovation. So it's reduced the amount of research into a certain product because, like I said, there's legal ramifications of what they can and cannot do. Next slide, please. All right, and so the next section, it talks about the market concentration regarding seeds of genetically engineered crops. So to define concentration, it would be for it to be a potentially concentrated market is when 4 or fewer firms control at least 40% of the market. That's potentially concentrated. And kind of one of the concerns with this is purported benefits of a competitive market. So things like fair prices, though they're likely to be diminished with the more concentration of a market. A study in 2008 reviewed that in the industry of genetically engineered maize, just 3 firms controlled 85% of the GE maize. And so that would be defined as a substantially concentrated market. And another way to measure these market concentration is the HHI, also known as the Herfindahl-Hirschmann index. And that's calculated by summing the squared market shares with all the firms in a specific industry. And if the HHI score is of 1,000, that's considered moderately concentrated. And if it's 1,800, that'd be rather a high level of market concentration. And then some of the concerns with that are most of these firms that control the markets are transitional international companies. So they're kind of extending their economic and social effects into international markets. So that's an even more concentration and more percentage of a market that they can control. So that'd be more substantial market concentration. And then the last section that I looked at was the investment into research. So as far as the private sector goes, most private sectors, they lack the incentive to invest, mainly because there's a long break between the application of the genetically engineered product to the publication and to get it to the market. One study was there was a product, they introduced it and started the regulatory review process in 1999, and it didn't pass it until 2011. So that's 12 years. And by the time there's been more technology developed in that field. So that's one of the things that deters people from investing into the private sector, solely because it takes quite a long time. Next would be the public sector. So people have generally expressed more faith and trust into the public sector, which would include university and government researchers. They have more trust in their studies and their results than they do in a private sector, and that's why most people invest into the public sector. And also, there's been more recent collaborations with public and private sector firms, and more to generate crops, but they've both started to focus more on major crops like maize and soybeans and more large scale crops, and back away from more of the minor crops. And one of the benefits to this would be benefits to investors. So it's critical to understand that if a GE crop, even if the crop improves the productivity or the nutritional quality, it would depend on the social and economic context in which the product was developed, and where it's distributed and how it's distributed and what's in the product before they could see a benefit back on their investment. Because some cultures, some religions, they have restrictions on what they can eat, how they get their food, how they make their food. So depending on how certain crops are genetically engineered, they could face restrictions and some kind of backlash that they did not anticipate before they invested into the product. And that's all I got.
And is that the end of the chapter for you guys?
Yeah.
All right, questions for that group?
I had a couple that I wrote down.
Go for it.
One is there a way, so in the beginning, I think Mary, you said that they kind of qualify themselves saying that there's like a lot of other things that could have affected this. Is there a way that they like statistically qualify that and like show that these GE crops are the ones actually affecting these small scale farmers rather than saying like there could be other things? Is there a way that they do that in the chapter?
I don't specifically remember that because they couldn't really do like controlled experiments. They would just have like the farmers who, were either doing it or they picked. So I don't remember it specifically saying that.
Yeah, I think it would be really hard to control for those things. I think it was one of those things that they do repeatedly in this book, which is before they make a bunch of reviews of studies and conclusions based on those reviews, they qualify what the limitations are of the conclusions that they're about to talk about, which you'll see over and over again throughout all three of these chapters. They're like, we're about to review some studies, we're going to make some conclusions based on those studies, but here are all the caveats that you need to keep in mind before you read on. And that's something that you'll see scientists do a lot, issuing caveats.
So I remember in I think it was chapter 4 in their presentation that we had actually found that because of herbicide resistance in plants, the use of herbicide was going up. To me, that confuses the point that it was saving labor. Herbicide.
Yeah, so one of the things about herbicide resistance in plants is that you would have expected herbicide use to go up, but in reality it didn't, which was surprising to me, because if you have an herbicide resistant crop, you should be able to spray herbicides on your crop. It will kill the weeds but not kill your crop, so you should see an increase in the use of herbicides. And what surprised me when I put my critical thinking cap on was that you didn't see a rise in herbicide use. And I was surprised about that in chapter 4. Does that clarify what your question was?
Yeah, it was just a confusion on my part.
Yeah, okay, not a problem. Other questions for the group?
The last thing I had was that it talks a lot about small scale versus large scale farmers. And I was thinking that like it talks about ways to kind of catch up small scale farmers, but what benefit would that elicit since they're showing less yields, they're showing like that they just kind of struggle with the GE crops? Is there a benefit to investing in small scale farmers other than it gives them work?
The lack of benefits that seem common with trying to invest in R&D of GE crops at the small scale level right now is primarily based around the economic cost of instituting the GE crops and of adjusting practices in order to account for the introduction of GE crops. So what investment at the small scale level would be focused on would be trying to mitigate those economic impediments that currently prevent GE crops from being a profitable enterprise.
And I think there's something else that could go into the answer to Blair's question. So the chapter talked about the benefits of GE crops are much less apparent in small scale farms than in large scale farms. And part of this is due to a change in the way in which farming is financed. that unfortunately for the readers of this chapter, we haven't yet gotten to. So in 1973, there was a decision made by the Department of Agriculture under Nixon to basically get rid of the ever-normal granary. We just started talking about the ever-normal granary before we took this diversion into these presentations. And what it did was it basically changed the way in which the government dealt with farmers in terms of price supports. And one of the consequences of that is that under Earl Butz, the advantages to farmers of large farms became much greater. And so the way to increase profits was to actually increase the size of your farm for reasons that we'll actually talk about on Friday. And so that's another reason why these marginal gains that you get from having a genetically engineered crop accrue to large farms and don't tend to accrue to small farms. And like I said, we'll talk about that more than likely on Friday. So if you can hold on to that question until Friday, I think we'll answer it then. Other questions? Well, we're practically out of time. I have a couple of questions for this group, and if you guys have any other questions, we can pick those up at the beginning of class on Friday. I realize that feels like an eternity from now, but Wednesday is an advising day, so we will not be meeting on Wednesday. So until Friday, just try and hold on to this information in your head. I'll try and get the presentations posted once I get the last one from this last group. And then I'll also get the written assignment posted, the guidelines for the written assignment. And I do have a rubric for that I have left over from last year. So I'll put a description of the paper that I want you to write and the rubric that I'll use for grading that assignment on Moodle. And then on Friday, we'll discuss what an appropriate timeline is for getting that done. And so be thinking about that also between now and Friday. On Friday, we'll continue romping through the 20th century history as it applies to agriculture. We're going to continue to talk about economics quite a lot because most of the changes that occurred after the New Deal era were basically a bunch of changes that all affected the economics of farming in many ways. So we'll talk about those things on Friday. All right. Thank you for coming, and I will see you on Friday. Vote tomorrow. Vote. I don't care who for, just vote.
Dr. Kowalski.
Yes, Branson.
You wanted me to come in for the test thing.
Yeah.
Is there any way I can do that tomorrow?
Yeah. What time is good for you?
I have class until 10:30, so anytime after that.
Okay, why don't we do it right at 10:30 because I have lab in the morning and then I have office hours right after lab. So I would like to eventually end my day so I can go vote.
Okay. All right.
All right. I'll see you tomorrow then at 10:30. Just come by my office.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right. Thanks.